What would happen if Israel forgot what God had done for them? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on walking through the Bible.
His word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8. We're going to be reading from verses 11 to 20. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning at verse 11. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes which I command you today, lest, when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you, to do good in the end. Then you shall say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God, and follow other gods, and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day, that you shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. By now, if you had been listening to this podcast in Deuteronomy these past 29 lessons, you probably have become weary with Moses' repetition of obeying God's commandments. If a preacher did something like this today, where week in and week out was the same topic, some in the audience might implore the preacher to move on to something else. But lest we forget, men and women are so easily turned from the commandments of God to the ways of the world. We're so easily turned to jealousy and hatred, so easily turned to lying and theft, so easily turned to fornication and adultery. Being told time and time again to obey God's commandments is a good thing, for we all need to be reminded of this, and Israel was no different. Think about all the times God showed his power to Israel, and all the times they murmured against him. In chapter 9, we're going to be reminded that Israel couldn't even wait for Moses 40 days before they turned to idolatry. Therefore, let's not begrudge Moses some repetition, for what he is teaching is worth repeating. One of the best ways to follow the commandments of God is by reminding ourselves of the past, as then we can see all of what God has done for us, giving us motivation for continuing to serve God. For Israel, it was remembering their slavery in Egypt, their deliverance by God, God's provisions for them in the wilderness, and God's giving them the land of promise. They were going to obtain houses they did not build. They were going to be able to eat from vineyards they did not plant. They were going to be blessed with things that they did not work for and thus didn't really deserve. But as they got rich, the devil would come and tempt them into thinking that they had obtained those things themselves. After all, who smote the Canaanites with the sword? They did. God didn't take human form, pick up arms, and slay the Canaanites while Israel sat back and watched. No, Israel had to do the fighting. And since they couldn't see God, the devil would tempt them into thinking that God didn't help them. They simply did it on their own, and thus everything they possessed because of their own power. But of course, such was not true. Israel wasn't a warring people. Abraham, though he did go to war on one occasion in Genesis 14, wasn't a warring man. Isaac and Jacob weren't warring men, and neither was Israel. For most of Israel's existence, they had been slaves in Egypt. How would they then defeat a civilization that by that time had stood for hundreds of years with walled cities and skilled warriors? It will be like David taking on Goliath in 1 Samuel. Without God, Israel would have been defeated, as they were when they tried to take Canaan after rebelling against God back in Numbers. But the devil is sneaky. He is deceptive, and lo and behold, Israel would forget. They forgot God's law, they worshipped idols, and they would be punished for doing so. We're going to find that in the book of Judges, in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah. All of this idolatry resulted in the Babylonian captivity recorded for us in Ezekiel and Daniel. But Moses here in Deuteronomy predicted what God would do if Israel disobeyed God. He said that God would destroy them. Israel tested God, and they lost. God did exactly what he said. In the next chapter, Moses is going to be giving Israel stories of rebellion that resulted in God's fury. The design of these stories is to remind them the dangers of breaking God's law, so that they wouldn't do so. We hope you'll come back for that. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 1 to 6, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.